And of course, this is a call-in program, so you're welcome to join the conversation. 617-396-4958, is the number. Just want to make sure my volume is at peak level here. Okay, that looks good. And, I am doing this thing of mine every weekday from 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And TikTok, of course, is one of my venues. You're welcome to join the program on TikTok. Let me just go live on YouTube, and then I shall be in business here. Let me just put this in so we have some consistency on that score. So anyway, yeah, you're welcome. Let me just get live here on YouTube. Thank you very much. Again, the program is live Monday through Friday, 12 noon. 617-396-4958 is the number. What is on your mind this afternoon? 617. What is that number again? All right, I just read it, so you can call it. There we go. 617-396-4958. And here we are live on YouTube. So I got David coming up in about 15 minutes. David and I often talk religious issues. I was a guest on The Meaning of Catholic with Timothy Flanders a couple of days ago. Really interesting interview. I appreciate his having me on. Really nice guy. Some rather tough questions in terms of, Christology, which is something that I want to be very sensitive about as a Jew. I don't, it's not something that, I want to tread carefully on that because I do not want in any way to question the faith of a Christian or a Catholic. But also we talked about the greater question of why is it that so many Jews, so many of my fellow religionists were attracted to socialism, were attracted to communism back in the day, and why so many of them continue to adhere to that heretical faith. And that's what it is. It's a faith. And I think that when David comes on, we're going to talk a little bit about that. He also wants to talk about the rollout of the vaccine and how this might relate to Jewish medical ethics. So, it's all Jewish. This segment. But let me just diverge a little bit and talk politics in that, as a conservative, as a nationalist, populist, as a libertarian, as a deplorable, a very staunch supporter of former President Donald Trump, I am concerned not so much on conventional political issues and social issues, which obviously I'm concerned about. But I am more fundamentally concerned about my ability to discuss those issues publicly and advocate either for or against those issues, and to do so in a manner that is consistent with American traditions of free speech. I'm concerned about it because I think that there is a diminution of free speech by the more radical elements of who is taking over the government right now, who is running the Biden administration, and who Biden and maybe some of the more moderates, assuming they are more moderate, kowtow to out of fear of their power. And that element is not consistent with free speech, not consistent with free press, not consistent with the free and open exchange of ideas. And this is concerning. It should be concerning to all Americans. But, it's particularly concerning to me as a conservative who is trying to do this program. I have had high hopes for my YouTube channel, particularly. And, it's depressing that I now have been told by people who know what they're talking about that the advancement of that channel is not likely, and that I'm lucky that they even let me do it at all. They're attacking people who do not agree with them. That is the world we live in right now. That is very troubling to me. Now, I made me think this morning when I was thinking about this and thinking about how the Biden administration, for example, has indicted a social media influencer for a funny meme that they published in 2016, and how they're talking about banning conservative media from the press conferences, right? And how, the shadow banning and all the rest. And I see people being taken down, including, more people every day. Steve Bannon has now been taken down. I now have to listen to him from his app, his War Room Pandemic, which is a really good show, by the way. And I think Rudolph Giuliani's YouTube station has been expunged. This is a former mayor of New York. I mean, because he's pro-Trump. And that how people who are pro-Trump are running the risk of losing their jobs, having their accounts canceled, being ostracized, being shunned, being socially marginalized. And, it made me think about the fact that when President Trump was first elected in 2016, there was a huge radical reaction from the left. And I can tell you some stories, even things that happened in my own life. I won't, without getting into details. I was called into the office of the person that ran the office where I was at the time writing life and health insurance policies. And he asked me point blank, did I support Donald Trump? And I answered the question. I said, yes, I do. I support Donald Trump. And essentially in that same meeting, he told me that I would not be able to come back to the office, that I'd have to work from home. And so I had to pack up my desk and leave, never to come back. And I ended up trying to work from home for a while, but I eventually threw in the towel. Likewise, there are some other examples that are even worse in my life of things that happened to me at that time. Now I'm in Boston, so you have to mitigate that factor into it. But several of my professional and personal relationships were ended at that time. And I don't want to go too far into this but I think that what I'm saying very well is similar to experiences that other people had who were supporters of the president and of the administration at that time. But what it made me think of, excuse me, this morning, let me just there we go. Thank you very much. Okay, so we're now recording. I always forget to do that. We're recording for Minds and for Rumble because I'm on various alternative venues. In case one of them pulls the plug, I'm going to be on the others in this atmosphere we're in. Anyway, so for you joining me on Minds and Rumble, let me just reiterate that, my concern now is more than simply legitimate and appropriate criticism of the present administration, the present culture of the administration, the present agenda, and also criticism of the means and the manner by which this particular administration was installed, which is something that I know I cannot talk about any longer on YouTube. So I think we all know what I'm talking about when I'm replying there. But of course, even the fact that I've said that gets into a more fundamental concern, which is that we no longer have, it's in the de facto sense, free speech in this country, or at least as free a speech, or as free an ability to communicate, whether it be by speech, press, or otherwise, that we had previously. And that the opposition it's not so much that we're in the loyal opposition, which I consider myself to be, but it's that we won't even be able to express the nature of that opposition because we're being expunged. And people that I know have been and are expunged now from YouTube and from certainly from Twitter and from other venues, simply because of what they believe. And what they believe, we're talking conventional things here. I'm not talking about anybody that advocates violence or anyone that advocates, overthrowing the government like a group like Antifa or something like that. I'm talking about people who embrace conservative, libertarian, various values and ideas, and that they are being expunged, they are being silenced, and that I recounted, and I'll just get into it briefly for the sake of my minds and Rumble followers, that when after the 2016 election, there was a very harsh and brutal reaction from the left, and in my personal case, it affected me. I at the time was working in an office of insurance salesmen, selling life and health insurance, and I was brought into that office by the manager, who asked me point blank, "Do you support Donald Trump?" And I answered the question, "Yes, I do." Probably shouldn't have answered the question under that atmosphere, because in that same conversation, he told me that I should not come back to the office. And so I had to pack my desk up and leave. He said I could work from home, so I wouldn't be exposed, no one would be exposed to me. And of course, I tried that. It didn't really work out. And there were a couple of other experiences that I had at that time, which were worse, because I was an open and proud and unabashed supporter of the administration at that time, that being the Trump administration. So this kind of purge, this kind of, like fascistic fear, this sort of, what I call a creeping Nazism, is something that was quite real in my life. I don't need to get into more details because I think that a lot of the people watching and listening to this program know what I'm talking about. But it made me remember that right after the election of 2016, in the frenzy of rage and hate that followed that, Massachusetts Attorney General Maura Healey set up a hotline, an 800 number, to blow a whistle on a Trump supporter, basically. And at the time, we still had in this country enough scruples from the mainstream media and from the left. There was still a few shreds of conscience there that this was overall criticized and condemned and seen as a mistake, and that she pulled it down pretty quickly. I think it was up there for a few days. There was a lot of outcry from the public, including Trump haters. It wasn't that bad yet. Well, I mean, at the time it seemed implausible, and most people perceived it as wrong, that something like this could be done. I mean, this isn't Nazi Germany. I remember I interviewed a woman who grew up in Nazi Germany when I was at the radio station in Fitchburg, Massachusetts. She happened to live in that town. Very interesting woman. She grew up in Salzburg, which was Hitler's summer residence, and she remembers Hitler, seeing him. I mean, she remembers one time being with a group of young girls, out on a hike, and his car drove by, and he got out, and they presented him with a bouquet of flowers. She also remembers waiting in line with a friend, a young friend, And this friend, they were like goofing around as kids. I mean, we're talking like, 6-year-olds, 8-year-olds. And the friend made some kind of a funny comment about, I think it was Hermann Goering or Goebbels or some Nazi, thug, some Nazi high official. And the comment was overheard by someone on the line, and somebody dropped a dime on them because of this. And we're talking about like a 6-year-old kid. And later that day, a Nazi Gauleiter, a Nazi figure in military garb, showed up at the house, knocked on the door, and warned them. Said, your son was overheard criticizing, the dear leader, and we're warning you. You better be careful going forward to not let that happen again, because if you do, you're going to be on a list. They probably already were on a list. Now, again, this was a 6-year-old kid making some stupid joke about the appearance of a Nazi. So, it's that atmosphere that most Americans reject. And it was that atmosphere that might have called to mind a similar phenomena when Maura Healey, the Attorney General of Massachusetts, put in a hotline for people to blow the whistle on Trump supporters. And yet, I am concerned that the reaction against Maura Healey from the society in general in this state would not be the same now. Now they will keep in the hotline. Now people are going to be turning on their neighbors. I mean, we have this case where, and I'm not going to mention the names, but this young kid turned in his father, who had made some comments about going to the rally at the U.S. Capitol and protesting. And he called the FBI. This is a kid. And then he set up a GoFundMe page and he raised $100,000 to help him finance his college. I mean, is this really what we've come to in this country? So then you can make money now by turning in your father or your brother or your sister or your uncle? I mean, isn't this what they did in Nazi Germany? And he gets rewarded for that? People sending him money. Oh, yes. You've saved America by turning in your father. I mean, might he have considered going to his father first and asking him about this and maybe suggesting that he not do it, maybe keep it in the family? I mean, instead of like goose stepping off to the authorities. And is this what young people are being taught now? Yes, it is. Young people in school now are being told that if your classmate says something offensive that might be seen as a little insulting, you go to the authorities and they go outside the school and it becomes a police matter. I mean, when I was doing the broadcast at Tufts University, I was, some student heard something that I said they found offensive. And instead of calling the program, I'd done an open lines program there, they went to this new police force at Tufts called the Code Enforcement or the Bias Enforcement. Apparently this thing was set up so that if anybody heard something that seemed a little insulting or wanted to make an allegation that someone had said something that they didn't like, they could report them to this office, and this office could then have them called in and their parents called in, and they could be expelled from the school. Well, somebody made this report against me, and they put my show up to 3:00 in the morning as a result, and eventually I left. David, how are you?
Excellent.
So we are now joined by David, YouTube host, fellow YouTuber. We discuss often religious issues, Jewish issues, Israel issues. David, let's start out by talking about the the rollout of the COVID-19 vaccines and how that might comport to Jewish understandings of medical ethics.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be really interesting, and I was looking at it from a few different angles. I mean, one is, obviously most rabbis are holding that we should take the vaccine and are obligated to take it, even if we don't want to. There might be a minority opinion of people who are anti-vaccine, but within the vast majority across the board of Haredi, ultra-Orthodox to secular, that is assuming taking the vaccine is a good thing.
Right.
Mm-hmm. But the larger ethical question is the fact that the vaccine's in scarcity, people are dying, God forbid, in the biggest number that most people have ever seen in our lifetime. And, almost, God forbid, like comparable to World War II numbers. But if this vaccine's going to work, it has to come out some way. And right now, the U.S. has a certain policy. Most countries have been doing, risk factor, age, some sort of like importance in society, which is a very, interesting ethical question. Like, who should be determining who's important? And then another question is, what about trying to get the vaccine for yourself? So in almost all countries, the vaccine is a government regulated thing that you can't even go to your doctor and get a prescription for. It's through special government run programs. I didn't even ask my dad. My dad's a doctor and got the vaccine. My mother's still in the waiting list. So I'm not sure exactly,
Well, maybe it has to do with also supply, but my understanding, and I was talking about this with a friend who's pretty liberal, and she was saying that like in California, there are so many regulations around the rollout of the vaccine, and these regulations can get so arbitrary in terms of who gets it, when they get it, how they get it, that they're really having trouble getting it out, and that if they did it the old-fashioned way, like I remember when I was a kid, and I'm a lot older than you, there was a rollout of a polio vaccine, and it was, in this case, a polio drink. It wasn't even an injection. And it just, the city I grew up in, they had a health building. They opened the door, they rolled it out, and everybody in the whole town could line up and get it. They didn't discriminate on any cause. So it doesn't matter how old you were. It didn't matter anything. Everybody got it. It was a first come, first serve. And
was there a form and checkbox? I mean,
I think it was just you lined up at the door. You went in, you got in. I remember there was a line too, and I remember waiting in the line. And you signed. You had your name checked off on. It was like voting. Of course, that's another question. But you checked off your name, and then you got the drink. And I think that the idea was just to get the thing out, get as many people having it as possible, and they didn't worry about age or anything else. And I think that it was just generally made available. Now, I think that in this case, that would be a good policy, except maybe one of the things that might hinder it is that there just isn't enough supplies. So they're trying to prioritize people.
Well, there's a lot of issues. First of all, the question, should there be a centralized authority that makes these decisions and oversees this all? Then added on to that, you say, yes, there should be, then how should they do it in terms of who gets it first, how they hand it out, the companies, can they make money off of it, or regulation. And then there's, as a private person, in terms of following the rules, in terms of, waiting in line, to say, what's the ethics of a person to just say, I want the vaccine now. I know that, I checked and they said I'm not going to be up till the end of the summer, God forbid. And it's illegal for me to go in my own process and try to get it, or even to pay on the side. There was a clinic in, Brooklyn, Orthodox Jews who were distributing the vaccine. It's unclear how they got it, or if they knew or they didn't know. And I actually know some of the people involved, and some of the big rabbis were getting shots. And then that court case is unclear. I think the DA recused herself. But you could even argue from a Jewish ethical point that this is saving lives. And if you could get a hold of the vaccine now, you should, and you should vaccinate as many people as possible, even through illegal means. And I'm saying, God forbid, I'm not encouraging anyone to break the law. I'm just saying
it's to
from
save a
an
life.
analytical point, you're saying, like, what's more saving lives than getting the vaccine to people? Thousands of people are dying every day. If you get the person vaccinated now, it will significantly, God forbid, if you compared it to, like the Holocaust, where it's like, just wait a few more months. And you're saying, like, I can't wait a few more months. It's literally saving lives. If you could get the vaccine to somebody now, how could you not break the law to do it?
Well, it gets into a very basic Jewish conception, which is pekuach nefesh, to save a life. And if what you're doing can save a life, you are able to break any laws, because the biggest and most fundamental law of the universe is the human life. So you can. I think it goes back to King David was like in the field, and his troops were starving, and it was Shabbos, and they couldn't pick fruit, and he said, "Look, we have to have food, or else we're going to die." And so they were able to pick the fruit on Shabbos. And the same principle applies generally in the Talmud in terms of putting the priority of saving a human life as the very first issue, and that any other rules, regulations, laws, commandments, all of those things come second. Now, I understand that there's also some reluctance and resistance in the ultra-Orthodox community because there are some questions, and I'm not saying any of this is true. I have no idea. But there are some questions about the content of the vaccine, that there might be something about it that could be described as not kosher. Do you know anything about that?
I mean, God forbid, it's possible that they grow it in pig tissues, or even fetuses, or aborted fetuses, or something. God forbid. I didn't look into it, but generally, if you were looking, why I was saying God forbid, how easily it possibly could have been a man-made bioweapon. But the vaccine is similar to a virus that, it's not as big as the coronavirus, but basically it's a determined strand of RNA that's put into a viral capsule and then fed into a cell, and the cell itself grows it. So the companies don't make the medicine themselves. They make the RNA strand, and then they use actual living cells to replicate the antibody. And this is how all, like, if you know the basics of medicine, I'm pretty sure this is how all antibodies work, that that it's made. So it's remotely possible that I don't mean to be like some sort of skeptic. I know you could probably Google this, but I was saying, like, yes, historically they have grown these antibodies in like pig cells, cow cells, like cowpox, if you remember, but usually chicken. Mm-hmm. And usually they actually use like chicken eggs, I think, like historically, right, that's the most likely. But even if that's possible to be a kosher concern, I think that's unlikely, because even if it was from a pig, that still would be kosher, because saving people's life, and that overrides. But yeah, that would make Jews skeptical. He's saying if literally the antibody or the vaccine is made using like pig cells, like certainly that would make Jews skeptical. And it could be that anti-vaccine people might spread rumors that that's the case, but I doubt it. And I'm not sure. It could be that the information is readily available. How they grow it, but they do have to grow it somewhere, and I think they have to use some sort of living organism to generate it. I mean, it's done in India, mm-hmm, even, right? The fire at the facilities, and I could see being pretty suspicious of that.
Right. Okay. So I think that's an issue. I also think we should note that the use of of blood work from people who had the virus is a therapy that is long proven to be effective in terms of treating the virus. This is how President Trump was treated. This is how a lot of people, get that. This is something that's a very desirable way to go. It's a very traditional way. And in that regard, you have a lot of ultra-Orthodox Jews who have had the virus going to have blood extracted and really going to clinics and running to clinics to get this done as a way to save lives, because that is one of the most basic and fundamental Jewish missions in the world, to save lives, all life, not Jewish life, everyone. And so I think that is a very positive movement that's going on mostly in New York right now, and I certainly commend them for doing that.
Yeah, anyone who's lived in an Orthodox community, or maybe even Reform, Reconstructionists, like blood drives are extremely common. I think even like progressive and Reconstructionist shuls, I remember, have blood drives, because I know the
Right.
person in charge of the blood drives here in Metro Detroit. And when I was in Borough Park, there were constantly blood drives, and people did it like, it was a mitzvah, and there would be these signs, like with statements by the Chafetz Chaim and signed by all the rabbis, and it was largely considered, if you could do it, you should do it. I think I tried doing it once, my first time. I fainted, and they say you're not supposed to do it for like 10 whole years if you faint giving blood.
It's not my particular cup of tea. I'm not going to deny, but
yeah, it's
but I appreciate it. I remember when I was in high school, and they said, the vice principal looked at me, is he going to come up to give blood, Mr. Moskowitz? And I'm like, listen, I'll write a check. I don't like to give blood. So
but I'd make a point that not just giving blood, but like organ, kidney donations.
Sure.
Jews, and specifically Orthodox Jews, are hugely overrepresented in doing this type thing, and it's related to our belief system. But from a general perspective, God forbid, that's only necessary like when someone is infected and in a bad situation, and yes, it could save their life. But that's not going to solve coronavirus, because that's only useful when a person is, like, God forbid, so sick that they might die, as opposed to the vaccine, which, according to all the experts, we could discuss the minority view that disagrees, that like 70% of the world has to get these shots. And, looks like we're pumping out like 1 million shots a day right now in America. And, it's moving forward. There's a lot of snags. You look at the numbers, people are dying. And, that's why I posed to the question, could you make an argument that you're from Jewish law, and like, obviously you could, and I'm not recommending it to anybody. I just wanted to talk about the importance of ethics of the situation and what's going on, and how much of a problem it is that the government is incompetent, that you are required to go around the government and try to get this vaccine because it's saving lives, and you can't risk the government's incompetence on this matter. But then you have the pushback on the other point, is like, no, it has to be administered in a fair, equal way. And, that's like the worst crime you could commit. That's like, quintessential, like, Jew who, I want to be at the front of the line because I'm more important. And it's like, no, absolutely not. But in reality, at what point do you say the government is just incompetent? You say, like, yeah, fair and equitable makes sense, but they're just incompetent. They're not getting it done. How long does it pay to, virtue signal and wait and pretend like
Right, and there are some people, it's been reported, that are people of means who are trying to cut corners to get the vaccine and get in front of the line. I think we should also note that the state of Israel has a long tradition of being right out front and right out in the middle of things whenever there is an emergency in the world, whether it be a natural disaster or whether it be a disease. The Israeli doctors, Israeli teams of experts are the first people to show up, and they are very good and very effective at trying to deal with that. So it's part of the overall ethos, if you will, of the state of Israel. And I just think that that's something we should mention.
Well, I mean, Jews in general. That's why I said that even Reform, Reconstructionist, progressive, LGBT synagogues have blood drives. That's a universal Jewish type charity thing that all Jews basically that have a synagogue are likely to get together and say, like, yeah, we should do this. It's a good deed because it coincides with Jewish values. But here you have a dilemma where there's a downside, saying that this is literally like the cases in the Talmud, the cases of like the trolley problem, where I mean, God forbid it's like Obamacare and the death panels, and at this point we are here because you have a vaccine and there's not enough for everybody, and it has to be rolled out. That you have basically government death panels that are deciding whose lives are more important than others, and it's too late. It's already working that way.
Right.
So, saying, is it?
Something I don't know if I'm not sure I would
this
describe.
Discussion should have happened. Did it happen? And we miss it?
David, I would not describe it as a death panel. I mean, I think that they're looking at the people that are most vulnerable to dying from the disease. It's like a triage in a military struggle. If you have like
it's the exact same thing that people were concerned about in Obamacare.
No, it's not the same thing. No,
rationing care, that there would not be enough care for everybody, or not enough money to pay for care for everybody. So there would be a government panel that would decide who gets care and who doesn't get care, and that's exactly what's happening now. There's a government panel that's deciding who gets the vaccine and who doesn't.
No, I don't think it's comparable. I think that in the case of Obamacare, you have bureaucrats deciding who gets medical care and who doesn't, based upon whether or not they think you have a life worth living. Very Nazi.
That's exactly what's happening now.
No, it's not what's happening, because
it's probably even worse than that.
No, it's not worse, because the fact is we know from the CDC statistics that younger people very rarely even get sick from this disease, let alone die. The people that are the most vulnerable are people over 80 in terms of the statistically that they're going to die. So they should get it first because their lives are more directly at risk. Whereas a younger or somebody who has a pre-existing medical condition like diabetes or high blood pressure or heart disease or cancer, they are more likely to die from the disease. So they get it first. It's like a triage in a battlefield. When you get incoming wounded, you take a look at which one is most likely to survive and treat them. And if someone is too far gone, then they might not get treated as quickly because it's an emergency and it's a matter of saving life. And if someone, the likelihood of a teenager or a 20-year-old dying from this disease is infinitesimal. So therefore, it's much more of an elective as opposed to an urgency. But let me just switch gears a little bit. Before I do, let me give out the phone number. We are doing a live program here. You're welcome to call in and discuss this or any other issue that's on your mind. David and I do this thing every Thursday. So, we tend to talk about Jewish issues, but we could talk about anything. We talk about politics. So whatever you want to discuss. 617-396-4958 is the phone number. 617-396-4958. So, David, I was a guest on The Meaning of Catholic, which is a pretty big YouTube program hosted by Timothy Flanders, who interviewed me. Mainly, the opening for that was the topic of my book, God is God. But he did tell me in his request to interview me that he wanted to talk about Jewish Catholic issues, and he wanted to ask me why I felt that so many Jews had been communists and Bolsheviks and all of that. And we had a really, really good interview. He's a really nice guy, very responsible, very scholarly. They've got a tremendous channel where they discuss, nuances of Catholic faith, mostly with Catholic theologians and scholars and thinkers. And so if you want to check that out, it's on YouTube. The show's going gangbusters. There's a lot of commentary on it, and it's called The Meaning of Catholic, and you can look it up on YouTube. Of course, one of the topics that we got into that is a tricky topic, and it's one that I tried to tread carefully on, was why don't Jews believe in Jesus? And he brought up the issue, which I think might be relevant to discuss now, and which is often brought up by Christians, and perfectly legitimately, and that is their proof texts as they look at the Torah, what they, the Decalogue. They look at the writings. They look at the prophets. They look at the Pentateuch, as they call it, and they find passages there that they claim prove that Jesus was the Christ. Now, he asked me what I thought of that, and he read several of those texts to me. And you know what they are. I mean, they're pretty famous, particularly the book of Daniel, I think is emphasized. And my thoughts on that were that, first of all, while I respect the Christian understanding of that, and I think it's a perfectly legitimate approach, we see it differently. These are our texts. We've had those texts for 1,000 years before Jesus was on the scene. Our rabbis go way back in terms of looking at and understanding those texts. And it's just simply a difference of opinion that's probably will not be reconciled, nor should it be, which is why we have two different religions, why we have two different, in a sense, strains of Judaism, one messianic around Jesus and one not. And that I'm not a rabbi, I'm not a Jewish scholar, but I know that we could have a Jewish scholar go through these texts point by point and talk about the Jewish understanding of what they mean. But, it's always a very tricky kind of conversation to have, because it brings up the question of why don't Jews believe in Jesus, which, of course, is a big question. I mean, it's, we do believe in God, is my answer. David?
Yeah, I mean, from a theoretical level, I'm developing, and hopefully going to come out with a book. We may hopefully this year even called multiple truth hypothesis. But from an intellectual level, what needs to be done is to have a firm understanding of what people's axioms are, and then to examine the logical conclusions of those axioms. And so a Judeo-Christian dialogue, you could confirm quite a few axioms. So if you had a Jew and a Christian, and we agree, so to say, that we accept the prophecy of this prophet or that prophet, basically, literally, or even with Muslims or the various things, that there's a lot of principles where you could say we agree with the axioms, and then there's a lot of principles where there's a fundamental difference, and we could never believe. And but people are not really logical. And when you talk about Jews, you could have a difference in axioms, and you could say, as a Jew, your opinion on Jesus and ancient Israel is basically no more valuable than any Goy's. I mean, you could say that within a Jewish belief system or a principle, that I feel as a Jew that my opinion about the Hebrew prophets or what happened in ancient Israel is more valid than other people or their tradition, and obviously like the genetics, whether these things actually happened. So you have to really have multiple truth hypothesis to look at the axioms and what happens when you have slightly different axioms, like Orthodox Jews who reject evolution, who believe in evolution, and the different axioms that are put into our Judaism that cause vastly different conclusions, sectarianism, and even just the way you phrased it at the beginning, where it's like, well, why is it a touchy issue? Why can't you just say, well, by definition, Jews reject Jesus? Because multiple reasons that are overwhelmingly common beliefs held by Jews and said in the prophets and the sages. To say just the idea is ridiculous that Messiah died, that our Messiah doesn't die. The Messiah that we're waiting for would not have died, would not have been crucified. 0% chance. No Jew in their right mind is going to accept Jesus as the Messiah. They say, so why is it touchy? You don't want to say that? Or saying because you respect the person, you don't want to, or because you fear for Jews, saying like, oh, if Christians know, so these various issues versus, so put it back to you. Why was it touchy? Why couldn't you just?
Well, because I don't want to. I don't want to be
to,
put in an awkward position.
Like any Jew in their right mind, rejects Jesus.
Yeah, I agree.
Obvious reasons.
That's right, but I don't want to be in a position on a Christian program to be questioning the divinity of Jesus. At the same time, I made 2 points. The first is that the Jewish.
Isn't that your obligation as a Jew, even?
And I did. The Jewish conception of Messiah is different.
To Claire call you on that, but weren't you called up before the council, and instead of
I don't want to be. I don't.
A Jew. Yeah, I didn't see the show, but you're saying, did you bow
No,
did you bow to the
not
cross,
at all.
or did you?
I did not.
You say, I'm going to say.
No, I did say it. I just tried to do it. No, I did not bow to the cross. I don't bow to anybody. I only bow to God. And I did speak plainly, but I did it in a way that tried to be sensitive. The point I made 2 points. Firstly, that the Jewish conception of Messiah is very different than the Christian conception. We believe that the Messiah is going to be assumedly a man, maybe a woman, but it's going to be a political and military leader who will come at a time when the Jewish people had reached a level of spirituality, a level of knowing God, that they were prepared to accept that Messiah, and that the Messiah would be the leader of the Jewish state and the Jewish people, and would launch an era, like a 1,000-year era of peace in the world, where all people would know God. Now that's, I know, kind of a simplistic look at it, but it's a different understanding than the Christian.
Straight like Trump. Like, Jews believe our Messiah is going to win. No Jew in our right mind thinks our Messiah was going to be crucified.
That's
all
right.
Jews think Messiah is supposed to win.
That's right.
So you tell us like our Messiah got crucified. That's almost.
Well, that whole conception. I mean, the Christian conception is that the Messiah is like a man God, is a son of God, or even is God. I think the book of John says that Jesus was God, and that the whole hagiography around that, with the crucifixion and the resurrection and the dying for the sins, the sacrificial lamb, that these are brilliant, but they're Christian conceptions. It's not the Jewish conception or the Jewish understanding of the Messiah and the Messiah's role in the world. So I just simply put it that we have a different conception. Now, the second point I made is that, and this is something where very few people agree with me, either Jew or Christian, is that it seems to me as kind of a regular schlub, as a secular guy, as a layman, that there are two dual covenants, that the covenant between God and Israel is forever, as Jesus himself said, according to the book of Matthew. But at the same time, the advent of Jesus's ministry does apparently, and I think it seems obvious to me, it does represent a new covenant. I know both of these ideas are paradoxical and even could be seen as contradictory, but it seems to me that Jesus's ministry is a new covenant, and for that reason, Jesus could be possibly considered as a Messiah for non-Jews, in that Jesus's ministry, however it happened, resulted in the direct introduction and transmutation of the laws and the moral and ethical precepts of the Torah to most of the world. And they did that in a way that conventional Judaism did not. So for that reason, I do accept the idea that the Christian covenant is grafted in, and that it is a covenant for the Gentile nations, but that it is nevertheless a covenant between God and the people of the world, in the same way that the Mosaic covenant is a direct covenant between the Jewish people and God. So, that's something that I base that just on simple observation. I base that on the fact that if it hadn't been for Christianity, we would never have a United States with all of our moral and ethical precepts that make up this country. And so to me, it seems obvious. It seems manifest that it's a covenant, and it's an important and valid covenant, and it puts aside the actual nature of Jesus and his divinity. That's something for Christians to talk about. That's not my business. But it does, in the broad sense, I think, draw up the idea that we do have a dual, covenant in this case. What say you?
Yeah, I was talking with this streamer called himself Judas Maccabee. Used to argue with counter-Semites. He was on JF and Eric Stryker. But we were debating Zionism and other issues, and he had a share on this week's Parsha and was talking about Maimonides and animal sacrifice, because now in the Torah readings, we're about to leave Egypt, and God's about to give us the law, and some of the first laws are that we should bring sacrifices to God. And so the Christian concept that there's a fundamental change in dispensation after Jesus regarding atonement, and the rabbinic concept is very similar, and it's really the dispute between Maimonides and Nachmanides, where the Ramban, Nachmanides held the general, probably majority opinion was that the fundamental way God created the world was that in order to achieve atonement for our sins, we needed the priestly class and the people to bring to offer our sacrifices in the temple. That is the prescribed method for us as Jews to come closer to God. And everything that we do right now in exile, in the grander scheme of things, is largely, I don't use the word meaningless, but that's the mainstream opinion. Maimonides held in a dispensational view that what was achieved by the power of God, through the sacrifices, which was generally the atonement for our sin. So that if I sin, God forbid, Charles or anybody sins, that the atonement process requires bringing a sacrifice in King Solomon's temple and being offered to the priest. There is no forgiveness for sin without that. So Christians holding oath because of Jesus' crucifixion that the atonement for sin is now available to everybody is very parallel Maimonides' dispensational view that we could achieve the atonement for sin from the sacrifices by praying, by saying Shemona Esrei, by reading the Korbanos before davening, to the hardline view of the Ramban that says, no, basically our Judaism today is a joke, and the only way for us to return to Judaism is to restore the priestly class and restore the temple, and anything without that. And it's also related to the Christian idea in a true, ancient Israel biblical sense. The only way to come close to God is, there's no Protestantism. You don't get your own private relationship with God because your heart feels with it. You have to go to King Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. There is no other way. You have to bring a sacrifice to God in the temple that was prescribed, even if you're a non-Jew. And the Talmud, I mean, you could reject it, have your own opinion. Generally non-Jews, Goyim, don't, Adam Green was on Luke Ford, don't need to get, people, be careful, but they need to go through the Jewish people to come on to God. That's the way God made it. They need to come on to King Solomon's temple to come through God. So you say after the dispensation, the destruction of the temple, if there's, even in Jewish theology, maybe Maimonides himself held it, is that you don't need to come on to King Solomon's temple or the priestly class and the Kohanim to come on to God. Any person through contemplation, meditation, like Abraham, and just thinking about it, could come on to the truth of God. And, so the,
let me just
say Jesus as an idol, that saying okay, just forget the Jesus part and just say the person came on to God, but they used, some false conception of, Jesus, which is the way Maimonides saw it. But that's the way that the Maimonidean school understood the dispensational change. And even if you're in Israel right now, the hardcore right-wingers say there was no dispensational change. We must rebuild the temple. There is no other way.
Well, let me just ask about that, because, I mean, my understanding is, first of all, that the Gentile nations do not have to go to Solomon's temple through the Jews to be with God. And my understanding is that they are with God as long as they are observing the 7 principles of the Noahide covenant, which of course goes back to the Torah, and which was, I think, synthesized in more modern times by rabbis. I don't know if it's in the Talmud, but the point is that the Noahide covenant, the 7 principles, kind of cover all of man, and that all of man can know God. They don't have to go and make a sacrifice at the synagogue, at the temple in Jerusalem. Now, this is one of the things that that Timothy Flanders at the Meaning of Catholic, he really nailed me on this one, in that he said, how can Judaism be a valid religion without the temple? And he said that when the Jews returned from exile in Babylonia, one of the first things that Ezra did and Nehemiah was they set up an altar and they reinstituted the cult of sacrifice with the Kohanim even before they rebuilt the second temple. So how could it be, therefore, that with the destruction of the second temple, the ability to function as a people in the religious sense ended because we stopped the sacrifice? And then, of course, the Christian answer to that question is that Jesus came to fulfill that. So I guess that I would ask, I mean, that's a tough one. I mean, my understanding is that the Talmud put in place through language and by codification a substitute means to worship, engage in temple worship until the day when the temple is rebuilt. And that includes things like, a sanctified wine and bread or challah on Shabbos, the observance of the holy days, the observance of davening and the various prayers and rituals around that. The kosher slaughter of animals can represent, I think an element represents the slaughter at the temple, and other functions of Jewish life that were put in place in lieu of the temple, because at the time the Talmud was codified, the temple not only had been destroyed, but it was after the Bar Kokhba rebellion, the Jewish people had been banned from Jerusalem. And there was a serious question as to when and how we would be able to once again regain the temple. But the idea of rebuilding the temple has also always been a central theme in Judaism. We pray for that every day. And that the assertion of sovereignty in Israel in 1948 and the further assertion of sovereignty in Jerusalem in 1967 were events that set the stage for the rebuilding of the temple at the right time. We don't know when that right time is going to be, but we hope and pray that it comes. What say you, David?
Yeah, so there's multiple points. And the first, I guess I'm here to give you unapologetic Judaism. So there's a lot of different statements in the Talmud. But the Talmud and the sages are very clear. You have the 7 mitzvahs of Noah, and anybody could rationally come on and is required to, all non-Jews, to recognize that there's a creator and that certain implications of that. But in Jewish belief, it's us, and the creator chose us and gave us the law, and as a non-Jew tries to get to know God better, they have to come through the Jewish people. Straight in the Talmud, it's one of the things that God said to Moses. There's conflicting statements. You could argue that that's not the case. Almost all of the Jewish sages, including Maimonides, who is the most liberal in the non-Jews' ability to use rationality and philosophy to understand God, still Maimonides says that non-Jews ultimately, to get closer to the creator of the world, have to come through the Jewish people.
How so?
That's the unapologetic version.
Yeah, but how so? That means they have to go to Jerusalem and give a sacrifice? I mean, how, when you say go through the Jewish people, I mean, I understand that the Torah says that the Jewish people have a special mission. We have an extra layer of observance because we wanted to be a priestly sect for all of mankind and to serve as a light unto the nations. But how is it that the the Gentile nations are expected, what is that supposed to mean to them? I mean, I think that my understanding is it just means that by observing the Noahide covenant, they're not engaging in idol worship. They're not engaging in pagan practices, and that they are knowing God. I mean, it doesn't mean, in a sense, they're coming through the Jewish people by doing that, because we are the people who had a direct experience with God at Sinai, and we are the people who are the receptacles of the law. But, it's not, what does it mean going through the Jewish people then?
Well, there's different sages, but I think generally that's what it's already in the Talmud and almost universal in all of the sages in the theological understanding.
Okay.
And so from a Noahide perspective, a non-Jew could be judged as righteous with no dealings or opinion on the Jewish people, purely on whether they recognized God, whether they acted moral in accordance with the law, and if they never met a Jew or never thought about Judaism and or dealt with the Jews basically the same as they deal with everybody else, they could still be judged as a righteous Gentile.
Correct.
Beyond that, in order to come to God, to be more praiseworthy, they have to recognize that God is the God that chose the Jewish people and took us out of Egypt and gave us the Torah.
Well,
and
I think that Christianity does
recognize that. Most rabbis or our scholars in the Talmud hold them at a lesser status of righteous Gentileness, and so the sense you could be a righteous Gentile who's they're a good person, they never cheated or robbed, and they give charity, but they don't think the Jewish people are really God's chosen people, or that we were taken out of Egypt and given the Torah. So it's yes, it's possible that those people are going to heaven and will have their reward, and so yes, it's likely that they will, and just because they were in action righteous people. But
David, I think that
unapologetic in the sense if they don't recognize that this stuff is true,
understood.
They probably don't have much great insight on God.
I think that in the de facto sense,
it's tough to be unapologetically Jewish.
Yeah.
In a modern
in the de facto sense, Christianity does recognize this because they embrace what they call the Old Testament, what we call the Torah.
I wanted to make the point on your second point about the temple.
Okay.
And the main idea is this dispensational truth, which is more a Christian way, but even Jews mostly believe in dispensationalism, is that the fundamental nature of how God acts with the world changed at some point in history, from the biblical times to the modern era, or even progressively. And, if it's we don't have a temple and we're not acting, offering sacrifices, I'm sorry, there is no atonement for sin. All the sins that we have done in our life.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's just a pure fact from our scripture. They say in the biblical time, when we were able to offer a sacrifice for the sins that we did, in this time that we're just not forgiving.
Well, this is the point that
used to have a list of the korbanos. That was even,
this is the very point
that you're saying that I'm going to have a list of the korbanos I'm required to bring because I'm waiting. So I think this idea of a dispensational truth that what karmatically caused cause and effect.
Yeah, this is the very point
to something else.
That
so Christianity making that claim that it's Jesus in this, and it's a dispensation.
Yeah, but you're in complete agreement.
Most Jewish schools, and basically all Jews believe
with
in some
the
form
meaning of the program I just did at the meaning of Catholic, because this is exactly what Timothy Flanders at the meaning of Catholic said to me. He said that Judaism is not valid because we don't have the actual temple worship any longer, and we're not, in a sense, forgiven. I don't know if he said that, but in a way, what you're saying agrees with the Catholic view. I think that, first of all, as I said, Christianity is a doctrine, and I think most religious Christians do recognize the special role of Judaism as a kind of a conduit from God, as a priestly sect, because they embrace the Old Testament. And even like St. Augustine, I think, elaborated on this with his concept of the Sicut Judaeus Non, which, of course, we know E. Michael Jones talks about that. which is that because the Jew is adhering to what Christians call the Old Testament, they are to be protected. They are not to be in any way prevented from their worship. But because they don't accept Jesus, it goes on, they have to accept second-class citizenship, and that they're not to be allowed to influence the culture because they don't get the whole picture. But nevertheless, even in that context, they do recognize the unique mission and the unique covenant of the Jewish people. Now, I don't want to go into a merry-go-round here because I'm not a scholar of it, but as far as the whether we can be, atone for our sins, whether we could be saved without the temple, my understanding again is that we are waiting for the temple to be rebuilt at the right time. That a Jew does hope for that to happen. I certainly hope that it happens at the right time and in the right condition. And when it does, I think it should be a joint project between Jews and Muslims. And I'll tell you why I think so. But
all nations, obviously, all nations.
Yeah, all nations. But I think specifically Jews and Muslims need to come together and rebuild the temple. But putting that aside, the fact is that in the meantime, the Talmud lays out a means by which we can receive atonement. Maybe, look, we're reaching toward the end here. Maybe I should talk a little bit about what I mean by that. And I didn't get into this on my interview on the meaning of Catholic, but
I mean, you're agreeing with me that it's dispensational. That just like Christians are saying that there was a dispensation and then it changed. That almost the Talmud also largely goes for a dispensational explanation, and that's historically how we moved from a priestly temple cult.
I mean, in a sense, we are like Christians
religion.
In that way.
And saying, so your Catholic friend says, like, you guys disobeyed Moses. And you said, like, no, Judaism and Moses himself says you follow the leaders of the generation, and the leaders of the generation told us the dispensation changed.
Right. And I think that, yes, it did change. And Christianity itself is a dispensation in that they replaced temple worship with worship of Jesus. So, sure. Yeah, I think it did, but I think the Talmud does that, and the Talmud did adapt to the conditions of the time without contradicting.
An interesting parallel of the Jewish switch to rabbinic culture and the Jesus switch that's very
to a messianic culture.
Way, they're basically the exact same switch.
No, well, I mean, one is based on the messianism of Jesus, the other is based upon the authority of the rabbis. But yes,
they're both based on the idea that you don't need to go to the temple.
That's right.
God anymore. That God
I agree.
Is available to everybody
that's right.
The temple.
That's
whether
right.
Whether you learn about it through Jesus,
yes,
or the rabbis. That's the message that they're both saying. The dispensation.
Yes, it is
different now that you don't.
It is what they're both saying. Well, wait a minute. It is what they're both saying, and it did evolve over centuries. However, contradict the idea that ultimately we do pray for the return of the temple, and at the right time we will build the temple. Now, when I was saying that I think it's a joint Jewish-Muslim project, I derive that from the Book of Kings and the Chronicles, in that when Solomon built the temple after he inherited the kingdom from his father, who was not allowed to build a temple because of the many sins that he had been involved in, and that Solomon would be in charge of that, he relied upon a partnership with the Phoenician, or the Sidonian, he's called in the Book of Kings, the Sidonian king Hiram of Tyre, and also with the half-Jewish builder of the first temple, that being Hiram Abith, who came into Jerusalem and actually set up the architecture. He had builders come in, and it was a joint venture between the Sidonians and the Israelites.
Yeah, the Freemasonic lore of the.
Well, forget the Freemasonics. It's a whole different subject. Yeah, they worship Hiram Abith. I get that. I'm not talking about that.
They worship Hiram Abith. There's
not to worship him, but they look at him as the founder of Freemasonry. I'm not talking about that.
But look at King Solomon as the founder of Freemasonry. Hiram Abith
was his builder.
The murder, God forbid, of Hiram Abith is an important lesson to learn to Masons that, like, yes, your brothers, the elite, will stab you in the back and they'll kill you after you work.
All right, I didn't realize that
but
Hiram
no,
Abith
it was King
murdered.
Solomon that did it, and Hiram Abiff is he's just the low wage worker that did the work building the temple, and his reward was being killed.
I didn't know he was murdered. I didn't know that part of the story. All I know is that Hiram Abiff was the mastermind who received the contract and was loaned to Solomon by Hiram of Tyre, the king.
The half Jew.
He was half Jewish, and that he was loaned to Solomon to help construct the temple. They brought the cedars.
I went into construction, honestly, like when I wanted to be a rabbi, yeshiva bacher, and just learn Torah forever. And, like I tried day trading, and after, I couldn't make, like quick money day trading and stocks. I decided to go into construction because I was like I'm a half Jew, and the most famous half Jew in the Bible
is Hiram Abiff.
So I went into construction. I still largely do construction, property management till today.
Okay, well there you go. I mean, I didn't know the part that he'd been murdered. Maybe that might be Masonic
that's
lore.
That's the Freemasonic lore.
Okay,
that's the main initiation.
But that's not the Book of Kings.
I mean, the initiation rite for Masonry is reenactment of the
Hiram Abiff,
and it's a counter-Semitic. It's a pro-Semitic and counter-Semitic.
It's proto-Semitic
natures. And King Solomon had the temple for the Jews and the caste, and the leaders of the nations met with King Solomon under the temple. But Hiram Abiff, just the lowly half Jew who did all the work, he got killed. And so the Freemasonry.
Yeah, but I don't know how. Look,
Freemasonry has an extreme level of. Oath at death. You can't.
David, if I don't want to talk about Freemasonry.
The initiation rite is this understanding that Hiram Abiff was murdered, even though he was
not murdered. And also, I mean, Freemasonry has a lot of hocus pocus and twisting of biblical stories, and some of which they completely make up out of whole cloth.
It's possible that the Hiram Abiff legends are only about 500 years old, and I'm actually.
However, it's nothing to do with
Scottish, and they rebuilt, tried to rebuild King Solomon's temple. I mean, in the Royal Society of London and Newton.
Sure, that's a whole different.
So it's very possible that these Hiram Abiff legends came around those times.
That's interesting. We should do a show on Masonry. That's not what I'm bringing this up to make. I'm talking about Bible. The point I'm trying to make here is that the partnership between Solomon and King Hiram.
The righteous.
Could I just make my point?
The Freemasons important because he's saying the righteous Gentiles did meet and discuss ethics and offer sacrifices at King Solomon's
That's
temple.
right.
It was part of the purpose of the temple for non-Jews.
Not necessarily the purpose of it, but what I'm trying to say here, if you'll let me get into word edgewise, is that the temple in Jerusalem was built as a partnership project between King Solomon and the king of Tyre, which is the Sidonian king. Tyre, of course, is the Phoenicia, which eventually the Phoenicians gave birth to Carthage. It became a huge, maritime empire, and they were Canaanites. Now, I bring that up only and also, by the way, the Book of Kings gets into the very interesting relations that they both had, in that, they traded lands. Hiram taught Solomon how to develop a navy and a naval port at Eilat, so he could then trade on the Red Sea. There was an extraordinary relationship between these two kings, and it was some of the diplomacy that went on between them actually set a model for diplomacy going forward for all nations. My point here is that King Hiram of Tyre, the Sidonian, could, in the modern sense, represent Islam, certainly could represent the Palestinians. And for that reason, on a biblical level, not the Torah, but Book of Kings, Book of Chronicles, the writings, I think that it could be argued that any rebuilding of the temple ought to be done as a partnership between the head of the Jewish state and the head of the Muslim people, maybe from Lebanon, maybe a Palestinian authority head, somebody, and that together they need to sit down and plan the entire enterprise as a joint project. And then once it is done, they can worship there jointly the same God, the God of Israel. So that's all I'm saying. It should be, to me, it would be consistent with historically, not necessarily religiously, but historically, the building of the first temple. Anyways, David, what else is new?
Yeah, I was saying if it be the proper Jewish theological framing for what you say is I want atonement for my sin. I want to be able to repent. I want to, like a reincarnation. I don't want to have to come back to have to fix some sin that I did, or I want the temple rebuilt in my lifetime. And I recognize that the only way to achieve that is to take part in the rebuilding of the temple. So just like a Jew who tries to be a good Jew and believes in Hashem, and I recognize I messed up, and I try to get closer to Hashem, and there's a block, and even maybe I try to be a good Jew and learn Torah and say Kriya Shema Shalmita and the special prayers and daven on Yom Kippur and all these various things. They see there's still a block between my ability to return to Hashem. And when we look into the Torah and the sages say, because I've sinned and I don't have full atonement for my sin, and the only way
look, I accept that. We're not going to have perfect atonement until the third temple is built.
To offer the sacrifice in King Solomon's temple. So it's upon us. I mean, even the Talmud says if the temple isn't rebuilt in your lifetime, it's like it was destroyed in your lifetime. But it's saying that you put it on the person to say, if you really are scared of the punishment for sin, you would know, like, oh man, like Charles, like I really messed up. I think the only way I'm going to be able to get to heaven is if the temple's rebuilt in our lifetime.
No, so I accept that maybe
they say, like, but that was the idea of reform. Like, are we really backwards, superstitious people that are God forbid, like, and to a certain extent, say, unapologetic Judaism is yes. That we have to say.
No, look, I accept that we're not going to get perfect atonement until the temple is built. In the meantime, we get imperfect atonement through the Talmud and through observance of the Jewish scriptures and through things like Yom Kippur and all of the holy days. It's not going to be absolute perfect atonement. I accept the idea that probably can only happen or would only happen with the rebuilding of the temple and the return of the sacrifice. And I will end it by simply noting that this event, this return of the temple, the rebuilding of the temple, is going to have to be done based on the Book of Kings, based on the history of King Solomon and King Hiram of Tyre. It's going to have to be done as a joint venture between the Israeli Jews and the Palestinian Arabs. They're going to have to come together. They're going to have to maybe set up some sort of a Sanhedrin, which might be divided evenly between Jews and Arabs, to plan it. They're going to have to set the stage for it. They're going to have to agree to it. And then they're going to have to build it as a joint venture. And if they can do that, as Solomon did with Hiram, then we will be ushering in, possibly, God willing, not only the return of temple worship, temple sacrifice, and a complete fulfillment of total atonement, but we will be ushering in the Messianic age. So, David, on that note, I'm going to thank you for joining me.
Should I say, just quote the Rebbe on that?
Sure.
I like you saying, but just not even nothing of mine, but saying the Rebbe. First he said often, if the Palestinians, or maybe he said the Muslims, knew what the temple would do for the world, they would take down the Dome of the Rock and help us rebuild it themselves. And the Rebbe took the general approach that almost all the Jewish sages, the prophets, Isaiah, Maimonides, Messiah has to bring world peace and have universal recognition of one God. And that's why the Rebbe sent people all over the world into saying that, well, the Rebbe did more probably to rebuild the temple probably than anybody in the last 1,000 years without it, the Shabbatai Tzvi, like not even close. No one did more.
Shabbatai drew people away
than the Lubavitch Rebbe, but he said, like, he didn't go to Jerusalem. He didn't try to negotiate a deal with the Palestinians. He said, everybody knows, every Jewish school kid knows that first you have to bring universal recognition of God and world peace.
Fine. No, that's an
As
interesting
we said,
thought.
that if the Palestinians understood what the temple would do for the world,
Yeah.
they would help. They would.
Well,
help
that's
us
right.
build
And I
it.
think the
And as we
question,
said, like it'll be all nations when all nations recognize the
well,
one God.
but it would
And,
emanate
you know,
from.
they'll help. They'll want us to rebuild the temple, just like King Tyre, that initiated King Solomon. He said, "Isn't there something you're supposed to be doing?
Yeah.
Isn't there something your father told you?" And so, that was the Lubavitch Rebbe's understanding.
No, that's interesting. I always found that story of Solomon and Hiram of Tyre to be very interesting to me, anyways. And questions like what happens to the Dome of the Rock, again, that would have to be something that would be hashed out over many years, if not decades, by a joint Jewish, Palestinian, Arab
Well, I'm saying,
Sanhedrin.
like, theologically, the Rebbe's putting it as like the temple will be rebuilt when the Palestinians, for their own sake, are begging us to rebuild the temple because they
Yeah,
understand how
I think
good it's
that's
going to be
brilliant.
for them to have the temple rebuilt.
I think that's an amazing insight. Anyways, David, thanks so much for joining me, as always.
Okay, have a great Shabbos.
All right.
Blessings.
Thanks to you.